So you've got this awesome Arduino prototype and you want to go to market. Now, I'd be fooling you if I could tell you in a couple-minute video how to go from having an Arduino prototype to market. I teach an entire year at Lehigh in a graduate program discussing almost that exact topic. And to cover that in a few minutes is impossible. But I can talk to you about a few things to consider and also give you some examples of how deep it can go. So, number one, there's a lot of regulations around electronics and products. For instance, what is safe for a child? What's a choking hazard? How old is a child? There's all different ranges. At this point, you really should be talking to a legal professional. I'm not giving you legal advice. I'm not an attorney. But you should consult an attorney. It's the smart thing to do because there's a lot of issues that can come up. For instance, the safety and marketing of your device towards adults versus children. Other things like regulations. How about the FCC? Are you using Bluetooth? Are you using that LoRa communication we were talking about? Or any other kind of communications? Do you need an FCC approval from that? First of all, it's going to cost you a lot of money. I would again suggest you consult a professional that's gone through that process. And if you don't do it, it's going to have an incredibly negative effect on your company and even, quite frankly, your personal life. You can't do these things. We have regulations to keep consumers safe, and you have to follow those regulations. UL listing, something that plugs in. Most of us are familiar with buying lights or electronic projects. Does it have a UL license or a UL certification? Another process you might have to go through. Think about import and export. When you import components for your final product, are you importing them legally? Are you paying import taxes? Do you need to pay import taxes? These are all things that you really need to consider. Again, legal advice here is the way to go. A few other things to consider. Well, how about you come up with this amazing prototype and you want to patent it? Can you patent it? Well, I suggest that you click on the About page on arduino.cc to learn about what you can and can't do when developing with an Arduino. This is open source, and in general, if you're going to build something with Arduino and use other open source software and hardware, you're going to have to release it as open source, meaning you're going to have to potentially share the files. You're going to have to potentially publish them and allow others to know how you're doing what you're doing. So these can be negatives and they can be positives. I just want you to understand what's involved. Now, that's not to say that you don't prototype something amazing with Arduino and then you go to manufacturers and they create it in its own proprietary embedded microcontrollers, right? Your proof of concept can be with an Arduino. Now, talking about patents, what if you publicly display your prototype at a local event? Does that allow you to get a patent on your device if that's what you're interested in? Patents are really a two-way street. A patent doesn't protect you. Just keep that in mind. A patent gives you the legal right to stop others from manufacturing something related to your claims within the patent. So a patent's only as good as you can afford to defend. Open source is a great alternative, but so are trade secrets. These are all things you need to consider when going to market with your product. And if you want to really think about how deep it goes, what about your trademark and your copyright and naming conventions? How about the fact that when I was developing a product, I remember thinking, well, how big is the final product going to be and what box does it fit in? And you're like, well, I want a smaller box, but how about, did you ever think of how many boxes would actually fit on a pallet? Maybe if your box was just a quarter of an inch smaller, you could fit 5 of them across on a pallet, and now you're shipping far fewer pallets. And how high do they stack? I mean, these are the things you got to think about when you go to market. It's pretty intense. It's pretty serious, but little mistakes along the way add up to big mistakes later on. I'll tell you my number one, absolute number one, because I've fallen into this problem in the past when I've brought products to market. Whenever you're building anything, if I'm going to spec a product and use an LED, make sure you get the data sheet for that LED. When I was selling my products, I had to actually verify and submit paperwork that said if a wire was included in the kit, what was the coating on the wire? What was the wire core made of? Were the ends tinned? Was that tin? What kind of tin? What was the chemical makeup of that? You need basically an MSDS. You need data on every single component of your product. So do yourself a favor. When you go to buy something and you're prototyping, you're like, oh, look, I found this sensor really cheap off of eBay or somewhere and I don't really get a data sheet and I don't know how it's used, but I'm going to use this in the final product. When you get to the stores, when you get to those end users or those customers, they're going to say, hey, provide me with all the data sheets. I can't get one there. Well, guess what? They're not going to buy your product. So from the very beginning, when you order components and parts, order them from reliable sources and make sure that there's data sheets available for them. It will save you lots of heartache in the future. And one last note, when we talk about regulations and you're looking to launch your product, are you only selling them to the US? Because the US is one economy, right? If you want to start selling to Europe or anywhere else, all these countries have their own regulations. So you should also do your due diligence with CE regulations. That's almost the equivalent of FCC and UL and consumer safety aspects of products in Europe. And I'm sure lots of other countries have other regulations. I don't want to discourage you from going to market with your product. What I want to do is mitigate risk and help you mitigate risk. And this is one of those situations when you're ready to go, make sure you have a great team, great advisors, and a great attorney and accountant on board. Because even if you're launching a small product, you want to make sure you do it right. You want to make sure you're doing it safely and legally.